The Boss 200 series pedals are a great addition to the Boss lineup and have full MIDI functionality. Taking advantage of the MIDI features on these pedals can be difficult even for a seasoned MIDI veteran, but by the end of this video, you'll be able to control these pedals with the best of them. What is up everyone, Man Bun Meled here. I thought of this video a while ago and have had a couple requests to make it, so here we are. In this video, we'll cover what cables you'll need, all the MIDI settings and what they do, how to control this pedal with another device, and how to control other devices with this pedal. I'll be using the MD200 to show you all, but this guide should work for any of the 200 series pedals. Before I get started, if you know absolutely nothing about MIDI, you might want to check out my MIDI basics video first. Also, if you find this or any of my other videos helpful, consider joining my Patreon. First up, cabling. Usually for most devices, this really wouldn't be a topic worth noting, but the 200 series pedals use a 3.5mm TRS MIDI connector instead of the standard 5-pin MIDI connector most other pedals use. There are two ways you can go here. Buy the cables or make the cables. If you want to buy the cables, there really is only one option, and that is going to be the Boss 5-pin to 3.5mm MIDI cable. The cable is $20 a piece. It has a right angle 3.5mm connector and straight 5-pin connector. Be careful if you try any other 3.5mm to 5-pin connector cables, because they might not have the right pin out. I made that mistake. The only downside with the Boss cable is that it is kind of expensive and has a straight 5-pin connector, where I prefer to have right angle connectors on both ends. The other option, which is what I ended up going with, was making custom cables. I guess they aren't truly custom in the sense that I took a right angle MIDI cable, cut it in half, and added 3.5mm right angle connectors on each end. Links to what I used are in the description. Overall, the cost of the cables and connectors was less than $20, and you get 2 cables out of it. In order to do this, you do need to have a soldering iron and some knowledge of how to find the right wires. I'm not going to give you a whole tutorial on how to make the cables, but here is the pinout of the 5-pin and 3.5mm connectors. Be aware that the diagram of the 5-pin is the male side. The original diagram I found from Boss, which I couldn't find anymore, showed the female side. If you decide to use the same cable I used, you should know that the pin direction is different on each side. This could be an issue depending on what you're plugging the 5-pin into. You might be able to find right angle MIDI cables with the same pin direction. All right, that should be enough to get you set up with cables. Now let's get into the settings. If you hold down the tab division and memory buttons at the same time, it will bring up the settings menu. I would highly recommend having the manual for your device close by so you know what you're reading. It's not usually obvious. A link to the manual is in the description. There are a bunch of settings that we'll skip because they aren't MIDI related. Use the rate knob to scroll until you get to RCH. As I describe the settings, I'll put the readout up here so you know what I'm talking about. Right now, I'm going to give you a brief description of all the settings. Then later on in the video, when I show you how to use MIDI with the pedal, I'll show you what to change the settings to. RCH is the MIDI receive channel. When the device receives a MIDI message, it will only use the information with this channel. You can set it between 1 and 16 or off. You'll have to set the MIDI receive channel for all your devices in your MIDI chain. It's a good idea to give them all unique channel numbers. Next is TCH. This is the MIDI transmit channel. If you want the pedal to send MIDI messages, this is the channel it will send them out on. Like the MIDI receive channel, you can set it between 1 and 16 off or RCU, which is the same as the MIDI receive channel. Then we have PN, POT, CCI, and CCO, which are receive program changes, transmit program changes, receive control changes, and transmit control changes, respectively. All these can be set to on or off. Then everything from RTC to EFC all control what CC numbers each parameter is set to. They can be set to 1 to 31 or 64 to 95 or off. I wouldn't recommend changing them. Just use them as a reference. SYN is the tempo sync. You can either set it to the internal clock of the pedal, INT, or auto, AUT, which means it will normally sync to the internal clock unless it receives an external clock signal from the MIDI input. RTS is the real-time source. It specifies the source of the real-time message that are output to the MIDI jack. It can be set to internal, INT, or MIDI, MID, which means the real-time messages come from the MIDI in jack. Honestly, I have no idea what the point of this setting is, but it's there. MTH is MIDI through. If it is set to on, any MIDI messages coming from the MIDI input will be sent to the MIDI output. If it is set to off, the messages will not be transmitted through the device. The last settings show as P1 to P99 and P.00 or P100 to P.28 or P128. These control what patch each program change number is set to. From the factory, PC0 is the manual patch, PC1 is patch 1, PC2 patch 2, etc. You probably won't need to change these, but if you want to for some reason, they're there. Now that you all have a slight grasp of the settings, let's put them to practical use. First, we'll use the MD200 as a secondary device, meaning it will be controlled by a primary device. In this case, I'll be using my computer. The simplest way to control the MD200 is by selecting a pre-programmed patch on the unit with program changes or PCs. Let's set the MD200 up for just that case. First, we'll need to select the MIDI receive channel or RCH. It doesn't matter what it is, just make sure it doesn't match any other device in your MIDI chain. I will be setting mine to 6. Since we're not controlling any other pedals with the MD200, we'll set the MIDI transmit channel or TCH to off. Next, PIN will need to be turned on because that's telling the MD200 to accept program changes. It doesn't matter what POT or CCO are set to, because the MD200 isn't sending any MIDI messages. The device won't let me set CCI to off, so I guess we're stuck with on. Not a huge deal, but we'll just have to be careful we don't accidentally send any unwanted CC messages. I'll show you how to control it with CC messages in a bit. Finally, let's go all the way to MTH or MIDI through. Unless you want to prevent MIDI messages to pass from the MIDI input to the MIDI output, I just keep it set to on. Now that the MD200 is ready to be controlled, I'll go ahead and connect it to my computer. You might ask why a computer? Because it will be easy to visualize the setup, and I've already done multiple videos controlling devices with MIDI, so you can check those out if you want. Plus, you might learn something you didn't already know. I'm using a Roland UM1 USB MIDI interface. Because the MD200 has 3.5mm connections, I'll need to use a set of MIDI couplers to connect the UM1 to my custom cables, then to the MD200. I'll show you how to control the pedal with an audio sequencer, but the basics will transfer over to any other device you're using to control it. I typically use a Boss ES8, and you can see how to program that here. Now that my pedal is connected, I'll be using Reaper to control it. First, I'll go into my preferences and select MIDI devices and make sure the UM1 is enabled in both the inputs and outputs section. On the track panel, I create a new track and call it MD200 control. Open up the routing options and set the UM1 as the MIDI output. Now insert a MIDI item on my track. In the properties, I'll turn off loop source and apply. That way I can make the MIDI item longer without it looping. Under take media source, select properties. Select send as channel and change that to 6 because that is the channel the MD200 is set up to receive. Hit OK. This isn't absolutely necessary, but it ensures every MIDI message in this take goes to channel 6. All right, now I'll open the MIDI item and we can start programming the MD200. On the bottom row, I'll select Bank Program Select. This lane is how we'll send program changes. You can do it with Program as well, but I think it's easier to use Bank Program Select. I'll show you both. Click anywhere in that Bank Program Select row and the Bank Program Select dialog comes up. Here's where we set the information we want to send to the MD200. No need to worry about the MIDI channel because we already set it to 6. Set the program number to whatever patch you want it to change to. I'll set it to 1, so it should change to patch 1. When I hit OK, we'll now have an event at the bottom right around where we double clicked. We can drag that wherever we want. You can now see a dot on the program row showing there is a program change, but you don't know what it is set to. You'll see a set of numbers down here. The last one is the program change, so I know that this event includes a program change to 1. I'll go ahead and create a few more program changes and put them throughout the timeline. I'll then go to the beginning of the timeline and hit play. Whenever it hits that event, it will send the program change to the MD200 and you can see the MD200 patch changing. The same approach applies with MIDI control devices. Just set up a MIDI program change in your patch. Again, check out my ES8 MIDI video. Now that we have program changes down, let's talk control changes. Control changes will typically change individual parameters. Earlier when we were looking at the settings, I mentioned the CC parameters. You can find out what all these mean if you look at the manual, but they'll give you a number that they are set to, or you can change that number. For this example, we'll control the rate, which is the RTC. If I go into that setting, we'll see it is set to CC17. I'll go ahead and delete the program changes because we don't need them anymore. When I open the dropdown, we'll see a set of labels starting at 0, 0 and increasing by 1. These are the control changes. I'll select 17. It says GP slider 2. I'm not sure what that's referring to, but we know it's the rate on the MD200. I can set a single value or I can draw some curves, and the rate will follow it. Now when I hit play, we can see the rate on the MD200 going crazy. You probably won't need to change the rate that dynamically, but you can definitely do it with any other parameter. Again, when using a MIDI control device, set the CCs you want to change in the respective patch. Now let's look at using the MD200 as a primary device so it can control other devices. Like I did with my computer, you can send program changes and control changes with the MD200. If you're sending program changes, whenever you change a patch, it will send the program change for that patch. For instance, the manual patch will send PC0, patch 1 will send PC1, patch 2 will send PC2. For control changes, whenever you change a parameter, it will send that information via MIDI. So if we change the rate, it will send the information out on CC17. It might not be too useful for controlling other devices, but it could be useful for recording the changes if you're trying to repeat a dynamic parameter change. Since I'm still connected to the computer, I'll show you how to do control changes first. We'll need to change some settings on the MD200 before we can go on. Set the MIDI receive channel RCH to off since we don't need to receive any MIDI messages right now. I'll set the MIDI transmit channel TCH to 4. POT and CCO will be set to on. Back in Reaper in my track panel, I'll delete that item we created earlier. Arm the track to record, set the input to MIDI UM1, all channels. I could set it to channel 4, but at this point it really doesn't matter. I'll start recording in Reaper, then start changing the rate. For the hell of it, I'll change some of the other parameters too, then stop recording. If I open up that MIDI item, you can see the rate changes. I can also open that dropdown and see any other parameters that were recorded with that little dot next to the name. Now, if you want to send those changes back into the MD200, go ahead and change the MIDI receive channel back to 4, because that's the channel we send it to. I would also unplug the MIDI out connector from the MD200. That way, whatever you send to the MD200 doesn't get sent back to Reaper and then sent back to MD200. If you do that, the MD200 will definitely freeze up. It's already happened to me. Now, if we hit play in Reaper, you can see all the changes in the rate just as we recorded them. Now, let's get into controlling another pedal. For this example, I'll be controlling the Source Audio Collider. Check out my review on that if you want to learn more. Basically, when I change the patch on the MD200, it will send a program change to the collider. In the MD200 settings, I'll turn CCO off so it doesn't send control changes to the collider. I'll also change the MIDI transmit channel to 1, which is what the collider is set up for. I'll connect the MD200 MIDI out to the collider MIDI in, and we're ready to go. When I change the patch on the MD200, you can see the patch change on the collider. The manual patch sends PC0, which is patch 1 on the collider. Patch 1 on the MD200 sends PC1, which is patch 2 on the collider. So on and so forth. It's that simple. Well, that should be just about everything you need to know to use the MIDI features on the MD200. Hopefully this video helped you out. If it did, hit that like button and consider joining my Patreon. If you want to hear more about what I'm working on, make sure to subscribe and hit that bell icon so you're notified whenever I release a new video. But hey, until next time, rock on.